"Sir, we don't do special requests. Those are the store rules." These words echoed through the electronics section of the Best Buy in Union Square like a decree that no one dared to question. To understand how we arrived at this moment that would forever change everyone's perspective on customer service and transform a simple refusal into a viral lesson about creativity, we need to go back a few hours when a busy Saturday promised to be just another day of routine sales. You can perceive that some encounters are like seeds planted at the right moment, seemingly insignificant, but destined to flourish into extraordinary lessons about how rigidity can transform into opportunity. Carlos Mendez, at 28 years old, would never imagine that his inflexible dedication to company rules would be the catalyst for one of the most authentic marketing campaigns that Best Buy had ever witnessed. The characteristic aroma of new electronics mixed with the smell of coffee coming from the nearby food court, creating that unique atmosphere that only large technology stores can produce. It was impossible not to feel the pulsating energy of a Saturday in San Francisco, where eager consumers walked between corridors filled with gleaming gadgets, their voices creating a constant buzz that echoed between the tall shelves. Carlos Mendez adjusted his blue Best Buy shirt for the third time that morning, checking if his identification was perfectly positioned. 6 years working in that store had shaped not only his expertise in electronics, but also a work philosophy based on principles that, according to him, should never be compromised, regardless of who the customer might be. "Rules exist for everyone," he murmured to himself while organizing the gaming displays, a phrase that had become his personal mantra since the first day of work. It was a philosophy he had learned from his parents, Mexican immigrants who had built a dignified life in the United States by following every rule, every protocol, every procedure, without ever asking for special favors or differential treatment. How many times in life do we learn that equality means applying the same rules for everyone, without exceptions? Carlos had grown up believing that this was the fairest way to build a society where opportunities were distributed based on merit, not on influence or social status. For him, each egalitarian "no" was a small victory against a system that historically favored those who already had advantages. The store movement was intense that Saturday morning. The sound of shopping carts echoed through the polished floor corridors, mixing with animated conversations between customers and salespeople, constant beeps from barcode readers, and the soft hum of air conditioning systems that maintained the perfect temperature to preserve electronic equipment. Carlos knew each product in his section like a conductor knows each instrument in his orchestra. Computers, video game, consoles, accessories, cables, peripherals. Everything organized with the precision of someone who understood that order and consistency were fundamental for efficient service. He took pride in being able to answer any technical question, solve any problem, find any solution. As long as it was within the policies established by the company. Something that deeply touches the retail world is understanding that consistency in service doesn't mean coldness, but rather a guarantee that all customers will receive the same level of respect and attention. Carlos had seen colleagues in other stores making exceptions for customers who seemed important, and he always wondered, if we make exceptions for some, aren't we being unfair to everyone else? It was approximately noon when Carlos noticed a young man approaching the gaming section. Faded jeans, casual sneakers, simple hooded t-shirt. Definitely not the typical profile of someone who buys high-value gaming setups. But Carlos had learned not to judge by appearance. Some of the most surprising customers he had ever served dressed completely ordinary. Suddenly, everything changed when the young man approached and began asking specific questions about video game consoles, demonstrating impressive technical knowledge and genuine interest in premium products. There was something in the way he spoke, in the confidence with which he asked questions, that suggested familiarity with cutting-edge technology. What no one expected was that this apparently routine conversation would become the starting point for a discussion about flexibility, creativity, and the difference between following rules and using rules as a foundation for innovative solutions. Carlos walked toward the customer, adjusting his professional posture and preparing his technical knowledge, without imagining that he was about to face a situation that no service manual had foreseen. "Rules exist for everyone," echoed in his mind as he approached, not knowing that this familiar phrase was about to be tested in a way that would forever transform his understanding of the true meaning of exceptional service within established limits. Naturally, this leads us to the moment when well-intentioned principles were about to collide with a request that would challenge everything Carlos believed about equality, flexibility, and the art of transforming limitations into opportunities. Carlos Mendez approached the customer with that professional smile that 6 years of experience had perfected, his steps creating a confident rhythm on the polished floor of Best Buy. The ambient sound of the store, overlapping conversations, soft electronic music from the sound system, occasional beeps from the cashiers, formed the familiar soundtrack of another busy Saturday. "Good afternoon," Carlos greeted, extending his hand with the firmness he had learned was ideal for establishing trust from the first contact. "I'm Carlos Mendez, gaming specialist. How can I help you today?" You can perceive that some moments carry the weight of entire philosophies being put to the test. Steph Curry returned the handshake naturally, his eyes examining the displayed products with the attention of someone who truly understood technology. There was something in his posture that Carlos recognized, the silent confidence of someone who knew exactly what he wanted. "I'm looking for a complete gaming setup," Steph said, his voice carrying a mixture of enthusiasm and purpose. "It's for my son, 13th birthday next week, and he's completely obsessed with games." The question hung in the air like a golden opportunity. Carlos felt that familiar sensation of satisfaction that emerged whenever he could demonstrate his expertise. It was impossible not to feel the genuine pleasure of helping parents find perfect gifts for their children, especially when it involved something as technical as gaming. "Perfect," Carlos responded, his eyes lighting up with professional enthusiasm. "What budget are you considering? And does your son have a preference for any specific platform, PlayStation, Xbox, or maybe a gaming PC?" Steph smiled, and there was something in that smile that Carlos couldn't categorize completely. A mixture of amusement and something that seemed almost mischievous. "Budget isn't a limitation. I want the best you have. But there's one specific thing I'd like to do." How is it possible that an apparently simple phrase can carry so much potential for change? Carlos felt a slight shift in the atmosphere, that subtle sensation that every experienced salesperson develops when a conversation is about to take an unexpected direction. "I'd like to customize the console," Steph continued, his voice maintaining that casual tone that contrasted with the specificity of his request. "I want to record a personalized motivational message that plays automatically when he turns on the system for the first time. Something about never giving up on dreams, you know?" The silence that followed was filled by the distant sounds of the store, but in the small space between salesperson and customer, an almost imperceptible tension began to form. Carlos felt that familiar sensation that emerged whenever protocols needed to be explained and defended. Something that deeply touches the retail world is the moment when personal principles collide with requests that challenge established policies. Carlos had faced this situation hundreds, of times over 6 years, and his response had always been consistent, regardless of who asked the question. "Sir," Carlos said, his posture becoming slightly more formal, "I appreciate the creativity of the idea, but our policy is clear. We don't do personalizations or modifications on electronic products. We sell only items in standard factory configuration." Steph tilted his head slightly, an expression of genuine confusion crossing his face. The smell of coffee coming from the food court, mixed with the characteristic aroma of new electronics, creating a sensory contrast that echoed the growing tension between convenience and rigidity. "Even if I'm willing to pay extra for the customization?" Steph asked, his voice carrying a note of incredulity that Carlos had heard many times before. "It's not a complex technical modification. It's just an audio recording." Carlos felt that familiar sensation that always emerged when he needed to defend policies that some customers questioned. Rules exist for everyone, he thought, remembering all the times this philosophy had resulted in equal treatment for every person who had entered that store. "I understand your interest," Carlos explained, his voice gaining that tone of educational authority he used to discourage requests outside protocol. "But it's not a matter of money. Our policy exists to ensure that all customers receive products with the same quality and factory warranty. Making exceptions would compromise this consistency. What would you do if your most solid convictions about equality were tested by a request that, on the surface, seemed harmless?" Steph stopped examining the products and stared directly at Carlos, their gazes meeting in a moment that seemed to carry much more weight than a simple commercial transaction. "I understand the logic," Steph said, his voice maintaining a calm that contrasted with Carlos's growing rigidity. "But we're not talking about modifying functionality. We're talking about creating a memorable experience for a child." At that moment, other customers began to slow down, attracted by a conversation that was gaining subtle but perceptible intensity. A family examining nearby tablets cast curious glances. A younger employee from the cables section stopped organizing products to listen better. "Sir," Carlos responded, his voice gaining that firmness he had learned was necessary to maintain authority, "our policy doesn't allow personalizations, modifications, or any alterations to the products we sell. This applies to all customers, without exception." How many times in life does a personal philosophy about equality become a barrier to possibilities that transcend corporate policies? Carlos felt protected by his convictions, but something in the air was changing, an energy he couldn't identify completely. "And if," Steph said, his eyes showing a brightness that suggested his mind was working at accelerated speed, "I bring my own recording already, prepared, and you just attach it to the system? No technical modification, just installation?" "Rules exist for everyone," echoed in Carlos's mind for the second time that day, but this time the phrase carried a slightly different weight, a question instead of an affirmation. And for the first time in 6 years, he began to question whether absolute rigidity was always synonymous with true equality. Naturally, this leads us to the moment when inflexible principles were about to encounter creativity that would challenge everything Carlos believed about the difference between following rules and using rules as a foundation for innovative solutions. Steph Curry looked at Carlos Mendez with that smile that millions of fans knew from basketball courts, but which at that moment carried something completely different. A tranquil acceptance that made the air in Best Buy seem denser. The sound of a child asking parents to buy a video game echoed in the distance, creating an ironic contrast with the situation unfolding. "I understand your position perfectly," Steph said, his voice carrying a genuine understanding that surprised Carlos. "You're following the rules, treating everyone equally. I respect that more than you imagine. You can perceive that some moments in life function as bridges between what we believe is possible and what is really possible when creativity meets determination. Carlos watched that apparently ordinary customer walk toward the exit, feeling a strange mixture of relief and something he couldn't completely name. But Steph stopped halfway and turned around. "I'll find a solution. I always find one." It was impossible not to feel the energy change that these words brought to the electronics section. There was something in the way Steph had said that, not as a threat or challenge, but as a promise made more to himself than to anyone else. Carlos returned his attention to other customers, but part of his mind remained occupied with that unusual conversation. The following 2 hours passed at a normal pace for a Saturday at Best Buy. Carlos served a family looking for laptops for studies, helped a young programmer choose monitors for a work setup, and explained differences between sound systems to an elderly couple. But periodically, his thoughts returned to that father who wanted to personalize a gift for his son. How is it possible that an apparently simple conversation leaves such persistent traces in the mind? Carlosi wondered while organizing HDMI cables, but he couldn't stop thinking about the tranquil determination he had seen in that customer's eyes. There was something familiar about that confidence, something he couldn't identify. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when the store movement was at Saturday's peak, the main entrance of Best Buy opened in a way that made several heads turn simultaneously. Steph Curry returned, but this time he wasn't alone. He carried a technical backpack and was accompanied by 2 people with professional filming equipment. Something that deeply touches the human heart is witnessing the moment when someone transforms limitations into opportunities in such a creative way that it redefines the very concept of problem. Carlos felt his internal world reorganizing as he watched Steph head not to the electronics section, but to the customer service counter. "Excuse me," Steph said to the shift manager, his voice carrying that same calm he had demonstrated 2 hours earlier. "I'd like to ask permission to do something special in the store parking lot. Something that might interest Best Buy." Suddenly, the store's atmosphere changed completely. Other employees began to approach discreetly, curious about what was happening. Customers slowed down to listen better. Even the ambient sound seemed to have decreased, as if the entire Best Buy was holding its breath. "I'm Steph Curry," he continued, and Carlos felt as if the floor was moving under his feet. The employee from the gaming section explained that you don't do customizations, and he was absolutely right. But if you can't customize products, I'm going to customize the experience. How many times in life do we witness the exact moment when our most solid convictions are transformed from obstacles into foundations for something extraordinary? Carlos watched Steph Curry, explaining his plan with the same tranquility with which he had accepted the refusal 2 hours earlier. "I want to create a motivational video in the parking lot," Steph continued, "about how no can be transformed into yes through creativity that respects rules. And I'd like that employee," he pointed discreetly toward Carlos, "to participate as protagonist." The silence that followed was deafening. Carlos felt all the store's gazes converging in his direction, but his mind was busy processing a sequence of realizations that stumbled over each other like falling dominoes. He had refused a request from Steph Curry. He had rigidly applied policies to San Francisco's most famous athlete. He had treated a sports legend like an ordinary customer. What do you do when you discover that your inflexibility inadvertently created the perfect opportunity to demonstrate exactly the values you believe in? Carlos walked toward the group that had formed around Steph, his legs trembling slightly while his mind tried to process the magnitude of what was happening. "You defended principles," Steph said, extending his hand to Carlos with a genuine smile that carried neither sarcasm nor malice. "And now, we're going to use those principles to create something that can inspire millions of people about the difference between following rules and using rules as a foundation for creative solutions." "Rules exist for everyone," echoed in Carlos's mind for the third time that day. But now the phrase carried a completely transformed meaning. It wasn't about limitations, it was about how limitations can become ingredients for innovation when they meet creative minds willing to work within established structures. I didn't know who you were," Carlos stammered, his voice mixing shame with growing admiration. "And that was exactly why what happened was so perfect," Steph responded, his eyes shining with genuine joy. "You treated me like you treat anyone, applied the same rules, maintained the same standards. That's leadership in customer service." Suddenly, Carlos began to understand that his failure to recognize Steph Curry hadn't been an error. It had been the perfect demonstration of exactly the values that Best Buy should want to promote. Equality, consistency, professionalism that doesn't vary based on who is on the other side of the counter. Naturally, this leads us to the moment when Carlos Mendez discovered that sometimes the best answer isn't yes or no, but let's find a way that works for everyone. Carlos Mendez walked toward the Best Buy parking lot with legs that seemed to have forgotten how to function adequately, his heart beating like drums in his chest. The smell of asphalt, heated by the San Francisco afternoon sun, mixed with the salty breeze coming from the bay, creating that unique atmosphere that only transformative days can produce. "Just be yourself," Steph Curry said, adjusting the camera equipment with the naturalness of someone who had done this hundreds of times. "Tell why you said no. Explain your principles. Let people understand that equality in service isn't coldness, it's justice. You can perceive that some moments in life offer us the opportunity to transform our deepest convictions into messages that can inspire millions of people." Carlos watched the technical team positioning cameras and adjusting lighting, feeling as if he was about to cross a bridge between who he had been and who he was becoming. It was impossible not to feel the irony of that situation. 3 hours earlier, he had rigidly applied corporate policies to one of the world's most famous athletes. Now, that same athlete was transforming his refusal into a lesson about authentic leadership and consistent service. "Let's begin," Steph said, positioning himself next to Carlos in front of the Best Buy entrance. "I want people to see that there are employees who truly believe in treating all customers with the same respect, regardless of who they are. Something that deeply touches the human heart is witnessing the moment when we realize that our simplest actions can have impact far beyond what we ever imagined." Carlos breathed deeply, feeling the weight of 6 years of honest work crystallizing in a moment that would be seen by people around the world. 3 hours ago, Steph began, looking directly at the camera. "I entered this Best Buy looking to customize a console for my son. Employee Carlos told me no. And you know what? He was absolutely right." The simplicity of those words carried a force that Carlos couldn't completely comprehend. How is it possible that a refusal transforms into praise? How can a negative become inspiration? Steph continued, his voice gaining that quality that made millions of people stop to listen. "Carlos applied the same rules for me that he would apply to anyone," Steph explained, gesturing toward the young man who remained slightly nervous beside him. "He didn't make exceptions based on who I was or how much money I had. He treated Steph Curry exactly like he would treat any father looking for a gift for his son. How many times in life do we discover that what we thought was our greatest failure was, in reality, our greatest strength? Carlos felt tears forming in the corners of his eyes as he heard Steph transform his inflexibility into a virtue that deserved to be celebrated. "So I ask," Steph continued, now turning to Carlos, "what was your motivation? Why was it so important to maintain these rules?" Carlos cleared his throat, his voice initially coming out hoarser than normal. "Because," he began, gradually gaining confidence, "if I make exceptions for some people, I'm not being fair to everyone else. My parents taught me that equality means applying the same standards to everyone." What do you do when you realize that your most basic principles are exactly what the world needs to hear? Carlos continued speaking, his words gaining strength as he explained his philosophy about consistent service, about how small acts of equality build trust, about how treating celebrities like normal people is, paradoxically, the most respectful way to recognize their humanity. But here's the incredible part, Steph gently interrupted, his smile illuminating the entire scene. Carlos said no to customization, so I customized the entire experience. He couldn't record a message on the console, so I came here to record a message about him. Suddenly, the genius of the situation revealed itself completely. Steph had transformed a limitation into an even greater opportunity. Instead of a private message for his son, he had created a public message about integrity, consistency, and the values that truly matter in customer service. The best customization, Steph concluded, looking directly at the camera, isn't changing the product. It's finding people who treat products, customers, and principles with the respect they deserve. The video was finalized in just one take. There were no cuts, no elaborate script, nothing but two people talking about universal values in a way that would resonate with anyone who had ever worked in customer service or had ever been a customer somewhere. 3 months later, Carlos Mendez was being promoted to Customer Experience Supervisor at the Union Square Best Buy. The video had gone viral with over 15 million views, generating thousands of comments from people sharing their own stories about exceptional service and equal treatment. Rules exist for everyone, Carlos thought, for the fourth and final time, but now the phrase carried a completely transformed meaning. It wasn't about limitations or rigidity. It was about creating solid foundations that allowed creativity, innovation, and solutions that benefited everyone involved. Best Buy had implemented a new training program based on Carlos's story. Creativity within rules. Employees learned not only to follow policies, but to use policies as starting points for creative solutions that surprised customers without compromising consistency or quality. Steph Curry had become a regular customer at the store, not because he received special treatment, but because he received exactly the same respectful treatment as anyone else. And whenever he visited, he and Carlos talked about how small moments of integrity can transform into lessons that inspire millions of people. Naturally, this leads us to the understanding that sometimes the best answer isn't yes or no, but let's find a way that honors our principles and positively surprises. And that true customization doesn't happen in products. It happens in the authentic human experience we create when we treat each person with the same level of respect, care, and creativity. The console that Steph bought that day, it remained completely standard, without modifications. But the experience of buying it became one of the most shared stories about customer service of the decade, proving that sometimes the most rigid limitations can transform into the most extraordinary opportunities when they meet people willing to think beyond the obvious.